The governor of the Spanish Netherlands, the Marquis of Grana, welcomed Monmouth with open arms. He was anti-York, anti-French, and was more than happy to address the Duke as His Royal Highness. What with the King's secret finances coming to Monmouth across the North Sea, Grana also offered Monmouth £6,000 a year as well. Grana, knowing Monmouth's talents, also offered him a command of a Spanish regiment, though it is unknown whether this was an active or honorary role. But even though he was in exiled disgrace, as always, he threw himself into his military responsibilities, and everything he did, it was noted in his pocketbook. He wrote on fortifications, weapons, training, and the way the Spanish organised their regiments. An English eyewitness recorded, "The Duke of Monmouth has since his arrival been to view divers places, and especially such as our strength, observing the works and curiously taking notice of such parts and places which are defective, showing them therein not only a soldier, but an expert engineer." It was not just the military responsibilities that took up a lot of Monmouth's time. Having constantly complained about his lack of formal education, he began to catch up on some neglected reading. Dr. Wellwood, who we heard from in the last episode, recorded this fact. In his disgrace, he endeavoured to make up that want, by applying himself to study in which he made in a short time no inconsiderable progress. He took the occasions of his afflictions to inform his mind and recollect and amend the errors of his youth, which it was not strange he could be tainted with, being bred up in all the pleasures of a luxurious court. His military activities and reading would soon play second fiddle when his mistress, Henrietta Wentworth, herself journeyed across to the Spanish Netherlands. She travelled with her mother, Philadelphia, and they were soon all in a large house with a grand retinue of servants. It seems his exile was quite a pleasant affair, for Monmouth was even allowed to ship his famous horses across to him as well. The King's secretary, Jenkins, was kept abreast of all the activities surrounding the Duke. One of his agents, John Elton, reported to his master about 3 merchant ships in the port of Harwich, lying still upon the water as upon a mill pond, and of a shipment of valuable horseflesh going from the dockyard lines to the quayside. The report ran, "I saw on one of the Duke of Monmouth's servants in disguise, so I pretended not to be well Saturday night, and did not go by the mail. Here are 13 horses of the Duke of Monmouth, with their grooms going for Ostend, on pretence of going for Zierikzee, to a merchant, and a pilot is sent hither by the Marquis of Grana to conduct them hither. The horses are shipped today, but I think the wind will not carry them away." But we must not forget that just across the North Sea, Monmouth's uncle and nemesis, the Duke of York, was still plotting. He wrote letters under the King's seal that the officers of English garrisons should not salute or honour Monmouth in any way. With this taking effect, disaster was soon to strike Monmouth. Grana, through agents, conspiring with York, was informed about the true relationship between Monmouth and Henrietta. Grana immediately issued orders that they were to leave the Spanish Netherlands. Monmouth moved quickly, as he knew there was another, and very close sanctuary he and his mistress could stay in, the Netherlands. The Prince of Orange had been a fellow comrade in arms, and had often fought side by side with Monmouth against the menace of Louis XIV's France. William immediately welcomed Monmouth and ordered all men to offer the Duke the same honours they would to Count Waldeck. Count de Vaux, Louis's cunning spy master and ambassador, reported back to his king when English officers refused to salute Monmouth. It shows the level of support Monmouth had from the prince. Reference officers who declined to salute him, the prince sent to the principal persons amongst them, informing them that he would break the first man who should fail to treat the Duke of Monmouth as he commanded. This was to show support for Monmouth, but more than likely a direct snub to his father-in-law, the Duke of York. De Vaux, knowing all too well of William's plans and his desire for himself to take England's throne, intended to create diversions between the Dutch authorities and their English guest. He wrote to his master, Louis XIV, knowing that his words would be rapidly filtered down to the King of England and, of course, the Duke of York, fractioning the English court and royal family even more. For the French, having a disunited Britain meant they would not become entangled in European politics and future wars. Devoe wrote, "The Duke of Monmouth has been for some days at Diron. The Prince of Orange not only entertained him there in the grandest manner, but took care he should be received in his journey to Nijmegen with extraordinary honours. The Prince and the Duke continued to hunt together, and the Princess of Orange has shown extraordinary marks of honour to a young lady of quality from England, Lady Wentworth, who passes for the Duke of Monmouth's mistress. The Duke of York writes twice a week to the Prince, who generally shuts himself for 2 hours with the Duke of Monmouth when he receives these letters." York was incandescent with how his nephew had received and lauded the Duke of Monmouth. Finding his ways blocked with the Prince of Orange, he tried the Princess herself, Mary, York's daughter. One of his letters ran, "It scandalises all loyal and monarchical people here to know how well the Prince lives with and how civil he is to the Duke of Monmouth. Let the Prince flatter himself if he pleases. The Duke of Monmouth will do his part to have a push with him for the crown. If he, the Duke of Monmouth, outlive the King and me, it will become you very well to speak to him of it." York was being checkmated at every level. Even when his brother the King complained to Orange on behalf of his brother, the Prince knew it was a bluff. Years before, the King had informed the Prince that if he was to receive a letter from the King without this particular seal, it could be safely disregarded, as he had had to send it as it was, drawn from him by importunity. But the King was not content to leave all the rebellious exiles in Holland alone, in particular Sir Thomas Armstrong. The King wanted this evil influence over his son removed forever. Armstrong had long been Monmouth's right-hand man, a man who Monmouth trusted in everything, and a man who acted too much as Monmouth's father. The King, through his Dutch envoy Chudleigh, placed 5,000 guilders as a reward for the capture of the renegade Armstrong. It did not take long for Armstrong to be taken. One of Chudleigh's agents caught sight of Armstrong and Lord Grey boarding a boat at Leyden. The agent tracked them, and once on board, he pounced. Lord Grey, as he had before, and as he would in the future, managed to slip out of the authorities' grasp, and escaped. For Armstrong, however, now 60 and withered by campaigning and exile, was bound and transported to England. Once there, he was to face the full fury of the King's wrath, to be administered by, yep, you've guessed it, Judge Jeffreys. But the infamous judge did not have an easy task ahead of him, because, apart from Titus Oates, whose word was hardly worth a groat after the Popish plot, there were no real witnesses to Armstrong's supposed plotting and treason. Oates's only advice to the court was that because Armstrong was known to be an outlawed traitor, then he was not entitled to a trial. Simply proceed to execution. Hardly a thorough example of justice. Armstrong's defence, however, was hardly more credible. He informed the court that as he had been abroad, and therefore had not heard he was a wanted man, the case should be annulled. Jeffreys, you can imagine, did not have time for such weak defences. To Armstrong's complaints, Jeffreys bellowed, "We think it quite to the contrary, Sir Thomas. Now blink, and you'll miss this supposed trial." Armstrong shouted from the dock, "I ought to have the benefit of the law." "That you shall have by the grace of God," replied Jeffreys. "We have nothing to do upon this record before us, but to authorise execution." Jeffreys turned to the keeper of Newgate. "Captain Richardson, what are your days of execution?" Richardson replied, "Wednesdays and Fridays, my lord." "Then see that the execution is done on Friday next, according to the law." As this justice was meted out, Armstrong's daughter sprang to her feet. She had already written to the Lord Chief Justice and the King that her father's case should be thrown out. "My lord," she shouted, "I hope you will not murder my father." Jeffreys scanned the gallery. "Who is this woman? Must you take upon you to tax the courts of justice when we grant the execution according to the law? God's almighty judgment will light upon those who are guilty of high treason. Take her away." Armstrong's daughter would not back down, even in the front of the demon that was Judge Jeffreys. She screamed as the guards grabbed her arms. "This is murdering a man. God's almighty judgment light upon you." Jeffreys replied smugly and quietly, "I thank God I am clamour-proof." As Armstrong, now under the shadow of the axe, and seeing his daughter led away to prison, hissed at his executioner, "My blood be upon your head." "Let it be," replied Jeffreys, "let it be. I am clamour-proof." Armstrong was doomed, and yet is being related to prominent figures, such as the niece of Clarendon, Rochester, and the first Duchess of York, as well as his former command of the household cavalry, should have warranted a nobleman's death, that by the axe. But it shows how much the king loathed Armstrong and his relationship with his son, for Charles sentenced Armstrong to being hanged, drawn, and quartered. On the evening of his execution, one of his limbs was on its way to Stafford, where he once sat as an MP, whilst his head was stuck on a pike and placed either side of the putrid blackened skulls of the regicides Bradshaw and Cromwell. When Monmouth heard about Armstrong's capture and execution, he was furious, but so was his host, the Prince of Orange. The prince was angered that English agents had illegally removed someone from the Netherlands without his permission. Devoe again gives us an account of the prince speaking to the Leyden authorities. The Prince of Orange came to them, and without allowing them to speak, told the bailiff in Leyden that he was extremely impudent to dare to come into his presence after the infamous action he had been guilty of, in delivering up Armstrong to the King of England, and asked him if he knew the danger he was in at Diron, for the Duke of Monmouth was there, and would perhaps take vengeance on him for the shameful action he had committed. Monmouth was indeed angry, and was so incensed, decided to travel back to England, back into the lion's den itself. His pocketbook, his constant companion, contains his movements. The way that I took from Diron when I went to England, November the 10th, 1684. From Diron to Arnhem, 3 leagues. From Arnhem to Nijmegen, 3 leagues. From Nijmegen, I turned back again and went to Witchen, 2 leagues from Nijmegen to the right hand. It took a total of 2 weeks for the Duke to reach his father's side. Adverse winds and the need to avoid royal soldiers and the agents of his uncle, the Duke of York, all slowed him down. He was reported to be riddled with anxiety after he had been informed that the Duke of York and his Jesuitical cabal were now plotting on how to take the king off the stage. There is only one written account of Monmouth's journey at this time, and it was written by Reverend William Veitch. Veitch records, "Monmouth sent for Lord Allington, the former constable of the Tower, married to the sister of Lord Russell, and a chronicler of the siege of Maastricht, him being a great friend of the Duke, telling him that he must needs go to the king and acquaint him that he is in town, and has a business of great importance to impart to him." The king was astounded, not by the information that Monmouth had, but by the risk his son had taken in coming in person. As always, the king was dazzled by Monmouth, and the love he had for his son still poured out. After a lengthy discussion, the king gave the Duke as many jewels as he could from his cabinet, valued around £10,000. Following this, Monmouth, as before unseen, returned to Holland and to the arms of his mistress. Allington remained with the king for the next few days, as the king saw him as an honest, trustworthy man, and someone he could confide in. Allington was forthright, and did not shy away from the painful truth, a truth no other courtier would have the guts to say to the monarch. "Sire, you brought it upon yourself. I told you he was plain speaking. By turning the Duke of Monmouth out of all his places, especially his command over the guards about your person, and suffering such to put in who are the Duke of York's creatures. Any other adviser would have expected to have been locked up in the Tower for such blasphemy, but not Allington. In fact, the king asked for more advice. 'What shall I do?' he inquired. Allington was now hesitant. As a governor of the Tower of London, he knew the power and the ears of the Duke of York's faction. 'Sire, I neither can nor dare advise you in that matter, for if it be heard, as likely it will, it may hasten both our ruins.' The king knew the power now wielded by his brother, and the fear of popish arbitrary government which came with it. He assured Allington that any counsel would be treated with the utmost confidence. We can easily imagine Allington pacing about whilst trying to calm his breathing, but eventually the words came, and he gave the king his heartfelt advice. 'Now, sire, my advice is this, that seeing within a few weeks the appointed time will be that the Duke of York is obliged to go to Scotland, to hold the next session of his Parliament. Take care to give him his commission, and send him timorously away. And when he is there, send for the Duke of Monmouth, restore him to all his places, and remove from the court all persons that are suspected to favour the Duke of York's interests. King Charles knew what he spoke was good counsel. He was tired, exhausted by the constant battling between himself, his brother and son. He was saddened to see the rise of the court party, who had been his supporters for so much of his reign, who were now triumphant at the banishment of Monmouth. Perhaps finally, seeing the folly of his actions in not being firm enough with his brother, he was now determined to send York away, and this is exactly what he told his brother. Yet York, stubborn and unwilling to budge on anything, dug his heels in. York argued with the king why it was not feasible to be sent to Scotland. I have a great trade at Calais and other foreign places, and many years' accounts to clear with these foreign factors, wherein I and other great merchants in the city are concerned. Being now upon my journey, I must needs stay to clear with them, and therefore I desire earnestly to be excused. The king for once was firm with his brother. Either you must go, or I must go. It was crunch time for Monmouth, time where all his plans to rid himself of his nephew would be dashed. He knew Scotland meant banishment, and Monmouth's ultimate return and triumph. York stood his ground. I will not go. But Charles would not be browbeaten, and soon informed the council that, in February, His Highness shall go to Edinburgh to open and to preside over the Parliament. And so it seemed that the king had made up his mind, finally backed Monmouth against his brother, and for our hero, all would be well. In early 1685, Monmouth wrote in his diary, I received a letter from L, marked by 29 in the margin, to trust entirely to 10, and that in February I should certainly have leave to return. That matters were concerned towards it, and that 39 had no suspicion, notwithstanding my reception here. As Monmouth's return became more imminent, the more the Prince of Orange bestowed honour on him. Louis XIV's ambassador writes that William continued to heap caresses upon the Duke, joined in the dancing every evening, and even sledged with the Princess of Orange on the ice. On the 3rd of February, Monmouth again wrote in his diary, his triumphant return, he believed, was mere moments away. A letter from L that my business was almost as well done, but must be so sudden as not to leave room for 39's party to counterplot. Very soon his banishment and torment of 5 years was nearly at an end. It would see his ultimate triumph and his uncle's ultimate defeat. This personal victory for Monmouth would rank above Bothwell Bridge or Maastricht. But of course, as so many things in Monmouth's life, disaster was always just round the corner. On the 16th of February, his diary again records the seismic events of the day. Received from L the sad news of his death. O cruel fate. It was the news that his father, King Charles II, the Merry Monarch, his saviour, was dead. To make matters worse, Lord Allington, the man who had convinced the king to recall Monmouth and force exile on York, had died a mere 2 days before the king. The Reverend William Vetch said Allington's death was due to the bribing of his cook and the master of the household. But who would bribe someone to poison Allington? Perhaps Lord Sunderland, or even the Duke of York himself. Was there a plot to poison the king and Allington, who was seen to be in the way of such a treacherous plan? Vetch believes York's urgent rush to inform the king of Allington's death was a mere smokescreen. If he carried the news in such haste, and lamenting the heavy loss, it would blind matters to the king. Vetch stirs up the waters by stating the king's next statement to his brother. The death of Allington is a very sad stroke to the court. I, and his servant, thinks he was poisoned. I wish you have not a hand in it, of which, if I were sure, you would presently go to the Tower, for I am likely to be next. What did the king mean by this? Was he aware he was ill? Was he aware he was being poisoned and close to the end? York, according to Vetch, now appeared a humble servant and apologised for not returning to Scotland as he had recently been commanded, and said he would take journey next week for Scotland. But York's journey to Scotland would not take place, for within a day, the king was dead. Vetch was in no doubt that his death was in fact murder. Bishop Burnet agreed, as did the Bishop of Salisbury, the Duchess of Portsmouth, and the Earl of Mulgrave. The historian John Oldmixon wrote, "From what the Bishop of Salisbury says of that death, there is no room left to doubt that he was poisoned." The king's death was soon a heady source of propaganda for both sides, Whigs and Tories. The Whigs were not slow in stating the poisoning of the king was to prevent him recalling the Duke of Monmouth, and the papists would doubtless sacrifice whomsoever lay in their way. But for Monmouth, the Whigs in England, and the exiles in Holland, it did not matter how or why the king died. What mattered the most was the meaning behind all the reports. The fact that the king had been poisoned by York and the papists, Essex had been murdered in the Tower, and Allington had been murdered by York and his papist creatures. Monmouth himself retired to the Prince of Orange's apartments till 10 at night, and they too remained shut up by themselves till midnight. The Duke of Monmouth has been ever since like a man raving mad. He has been heard in the little house where he lodges, making bitter cries and lamentations. Whilst Monmouth tried to come to terms with losing his father, the man who had been a constant anchor in his life, York, now the king, was more concerned in keeping Monmouth out of Britain. He closed all ports, put militias and garrisons on alert, and even sent a letter to Orange insisting Monmouth was arrested and sent to England as a prisoner. William remained loyal to Monmouth and replied, "I took the Duke of Monmouth into my protection for the sake of maintaining the Protestant religion in England." The question would be, would the prince stay loyal to Monmouth and his aims, or was he playing a longer game? In other words, play both the new king and his hated nephew against each other to improve his own position. Only time would tell. But Monmouth, for the time being, was in no mood to stake his claim upon the English throne. He was devastated, as his world had just come crashing down all about him. Should he stay in Europe in the arms of his beloved Henrietta, or prove to himself and his followers that he was in fact a man of destiny and the rightful king of England? His exiled supporters certainly thought he was the proper king. For now, instead of toasting Monmouth as the Prince of Wales, they now toasted him as King James. The exiled lovers still needed to find a home, safe from persecution, arrest, and enemy agents. They had been banished from the Netherlands, and the Spanish Netherlands were not friendly either. De Grana, though fond of Henrietta and Monmouth, might well have been happy to turn a blind eye, but the Spanish king was eager to start off on friendly terms with the new British monarch. De Grana allowed the couple to leave without any interruption. Their destination? Back to the Netherlands, where the danger was not arrest from Prince's soldiers, but by agents from England. They had not been back in the Netherlands long, when at an inn in Rotterdam, one of Monmouth's servants heard two men whispering to each other. That fellow, who went upstairs, looked very like the Duke of Monmouth. Having passed on the information, the Monmouth household packed up and left by the rear entrance, and journeyed to Gouda, a mere 12 miles away. Monmouth's friend James Washington housed them in a pleasant home with stepped gables, scrubbed pavements, a floor of great checkered flagstones, walls lined with Gouda tiles, a spotless kitchen full of shining pots and pans, and 3 bedrooms with 4-poster beds with heavy feathered mattresses. Opening the mullioned windows would open a beautiful scene of green pastures, dykes, poplars and windmills. There were worse places to spend a retirement. And Monmouth might well have settled down and spent the rest of his life in this Dutch Toddington. But the new king across the North Sea continued his vendetta against his nephew, chasing him with persecutions and calls of high treason. If he had just left Monmouth alone, perhaps the Duke might not have committed himself to an armed invasion of his uncle's kingdom. We are nearly there, the famous Monmouth Rebellion, the Battle of Sedgemoor, and the bloody assizes. It has been quite a journey, but there is still a very, very long way to go for our hero. As always, thanks for watching.